I want to share with you that this notion of the resurgence is not new, even though we're titling this particular DIOP conference. But at the moment we were dislocated, at the very moment we were dislocated, African thinkers began to do the resurgence. They were called the vindicationists. They were called the redemption scholars. People like P.V. Vasty in 1823 wrote the essay on the causes of the revolution and the civil wars in Haiti. Here's an African scholar, African thinker, trying to understand and put an African voice, even though they probably wouldn't use that language, voice in African, they wouldn't use voice, but try to put a voice onto our interpretation of a critical moment in our history. J.W. Pennington writes a textbook on the origin and history of the colored people in 1841. Now I put these dates on because we struggle, and our students struggle with getting the term paper done on time. And they got internet and cutting and pasting and pulling stuff off and putting stuff together. And here's a black scholar in 1841 writing a major analysis of the origin and history of colored people. Robert Lewis in 1845 writes a book called The Light and the Truth. The light, the illumination, and the truth about our experience. And there's a whole series of black scholars from the 1800s up until very now. Edward Blyden, you all know, The Negro in Ancient History, 1859. Christianity, Islam, and the Negro Race in 1887. Rufus Perry, The Cushites, or the Descendants of Ham in 1897. All these are resurgence of African scholarship, African mind trying to relocate itself in this crazy mixed up place called the Western world. And W.B. Du Bois just goes crazy. He just starts writing all kinds of stuff over his long and impressive history. Carter G. Woodson, Rayford Logan. We mentioned Booker T. Washington, The Story of the Negro in 1909. And then there's a whole set of historians who some people call the scrappers and the scrapers without portfolio. Meaning they didn't get the PhDs that we got. The scrappers and the scrapers without portfolio. Arthur Schomburg, John Bruce, William Ferris, Hubert Henry Harrison. All doing what? Resurgent analysis. Being dislocated from their own ground and then trying to recapture balance, if you will. Capture balance. You think about it, resurgence really means when somebody pushes you, somebody pushes me, my instinct is to surge back. That's the resurgence. When someone pushed us intellectually off our balance, our instinct, our spirit is to resurge back, to move back forward. And so you get the Blinding Society in Harlem with Willie Huggins, J. Rogers, John Jackson, Chancellor Williams, John A. Clark, Joseph Ben Yakinan, all doing resurgent scholarship, if I can use that language to talk about them. But they essentially were trying to rebalance the record, to really talk about what it was to be African in the world. Now there's some factors that I think retard this resurgence, if you will. Some factors that retard this resurgence, and I want to call these the problematics of conceptual incarceration and epistemological traps. Because I think there is some conceptual incarceration that happens in our scholarship even today, and there's some epistemological traps that we have to think very carefully about, very slowly about. And I want to suggest to you that from this point on, I'm going to ask you to think with your spirit and not your mind. Quiet yourself. Think with your spirit and not your mind. Think with that synaptic point in your mitochondrial DNA that takes you back to the beginning of time. Now, we're not used to that kind of language. It becomes almost, not only esoteric, it becomes sort of fantasy. But it's not fantasy, it really is physics. And I want you to think about that in terms of energy. This notion of conceptual incarceration, of a factor that retards our ability to regain balance as African intellectuals, has to do with the recognition that concepts have the capacity to lock you up. Concepts have the capacity to limit the parameter of your knowing and understanding. The concepts you use as the critical discourse have the ability to prevent you from engaging in critical thought. That's what I call conceptual incarceration. The concept puts you in jail. In the jail, we all know as black folk, who puts us in jail? It's not any different on the street than it is in the academy. It is the intellectual discourse that is the jail. So we start thinking with white thought, thinking with Western ideas. Those ideas themselves lock us up. And it is insidious. It's very difficult to talk about it because I'm speaking English. I'm not speaking Igbo, I'm not speaking Fulani, but even the language itself becomes difficult. And in fact, so this notion of conceptual incarceration, I want you to hold for a moment. The epistemological traps is what John Henry Clark mentioned when he said the Europeans did not only colonize Africa, they colonized thought itself. Use your spirit, not your mind. They colonized thought itself. European hegemony literally requires the disenfranchisement of the discursive outputs of African cultural systems. You hear what I said? European hegemony requires the disenfranchisement of the discursive outputs of African cultural systems, and knowing and understanding is a cultural output. Knowing is a cultural output, just as knowing and analysis are cultural inputs. And so we got to begin to talk about how we're crippled by trying to blackenize white thought, trying to blackenize European thought, trying to compare African things to give them legitimacy because we find counterparts in European things. And we do it all the time in our intellectual discourse. We use this notion of religion. And we say, I'm jumping here, but I got to do it now because someone told me to. We say that there are African religions, and our religions are just as legitimate as European religions. But maybe the concept of religion is the problematic here. Maybe it is not the fact that the term religion, which has to do with ligament tie, to tie again oneself to the divine, is foreign to Africans. We don't have to tie ourselves again to the divine. If our epistemological and cosmological and ontological understanding of the universe already see us as divine. If we're already divine, don't we tie ourselves back? And so when we start comparing African religions with European religions, we get an epistemological trap. We start comparing African philosophy, European philosophy, we get an epistemological trap. We got to really think about these issues in terms of recognizing that for the only legitimate cultural accumulation of thinking and knowing for us has been the European experience. Let me say it again. The only legitimate cultural accumulation of thinking, and knowing has been the European experience. And so we become prestigious based upon how much of their European experience we have digested. We become, it's nothing to our fault. It was the only well to drink from for a while. There was no other place to go to get knowledge, so we thought, and the trick was that it made us think that theirs was the only knowledge. It was partly because of those scrappers and scrapers from the 1840s who were digging up things and sharing things that we had a basis to even tiptoe on this platform. And now we're dancing on it. We're doing hard stomps on it now. But before we were tiptoeing on the platform because we weren't sure about it, and we in fact had this sort of mentality where we always looked over our shoulder to see if some white professor or some white scholar legitimized our thought. And so we were happy when some white person said Egypt, the ancient Kemet was black. We said, oh, well, finally, they tell the truth. Who gives about what they think? In isolation here. We don't live in isolation. There is discourse. But to submit ourselves to this inferior position of requiring their approval for our own insights is, and I'm a psychologist, pathological.